Before we start, I need to mention that I will be discussing high-level Black Mage optimization in this video. Everything I talk about here is a minor DPS gain compared to simply playing well and getting good global cooldown uptime. The standard rotation has its place and should be used by the majority of players. That being said, let's get into the video. Why do high-ranking Black Mages avoid casting BLM is a question I see asked fairly frequently. Which is understandable considering most resources you can find advocate for casting BLM in every Umbral Ice phase. To answer this question, we first have to explain why you would want to cast BLM in the first place. In the standard Black Mage rotation found in the Balance, Arc Morning, and probably 5 other places, BLM is used for 2 reasons. 1. It is used as a filler spell in Umbral Ice to ensure you'll get the 2 MP ticks you need to use the standard rotation. 2. BLM grants you 3 Umbral Hearts, which cut the MP cost of your next 3 fire spells in half. These hearts are necessary to have enough MP to cast 6 Fire Force, 1 Fire 1, and 1 Despair. Since Black Mage does not follow a rigid rotation like most other jobs, I will now refer to single Umbral Ice and Astral Fire phases as lines to save us all a bit of time. Thanks to Yuna, we know that the standard rotation is not actually the strongest line you can do on Black Mage. What you see most skilled Black Mage players do is commonly referred to as the AI or non-standard playstyle. This is an umbrella term that encompasses a lot of different lines which avoid using weaker spells. The most commonly used AI lines are these 2 shown on screen. We use 2 main metrics to determine a line's potential. The first one is the amount of resources needed to pull it off in the first place. This commonly refers to the number of filler global cooldowns necessary to get the right amount of MP ticks, and determines how practical it actually is to use in a real encounter. While a certain line might do a lot of damage, if it completely drains you of your resources, forcing you to use a weaker line later, it's most likely not worth doing. While we're speaking of damage, the damage of any given line is determined by calculating its potency per second, or commonly referred to as PPS. You can do this by dividing the line's potency by its cast time, ignoring the filler spells, Thunder 3 and Xenoglossy. As an example, the standard rotation's potency per second is roughly 158 if we factor in the 40% chance of receiving a Fire Stutter proc from the Fire 1 cast. In comparison, the PPS for the most common non-standard lines I mentioned earlier are around 161 and 164 respectively. You are probably thinking that these are pretty tiny DPS gains, and that's because, well, they are. It's hard to quantify how much you actually gain by using the non-standard playstyle since there's a lot of different components to it, but it's estimated to be around a 2-3% DPS gain if used correctly over the course of an encounter. Having to use 2 filler spells in every Umbral Ice phase as opposed to a single filler for the standard rotation is sadly not really sustainable for a longer period of time. And this is where MP ticks come into play. Though, in order to understand how we can utilize MP ticks to our advantage, we must first establish how they actually work. Similar to Actor ticks like damage over time effects, MP ticks run on a global 3-second timer that is not affected by Umbral Ice or Astral Fire. This means that if you were to get an MP tick right after you enter Umbral Ice, you only need 3 seconds to get another tick. In which case you are not required to cast a second filler GCD before entering Astral Fire. If you get an MP tick in between your Blizzard 3 cast and your first filler spell, you could opt into skipping the second filler GCD. You can actually utilize this with the standard rotation as well if you treat Blizzard 4 as your first filler. Although you obviously don't want to skip your second filler if you need to refresh Thunder or would otherwise overcap on Polyglot. And now it's time for the questionable part of the video, third-party tools. Most players who engage in the AI playstyle use an advanced combat tracker plugin called an MP tick trigger. There will be a guide on how to set it up, linked in the description of this video, along with all the other resources I'm mentioning throughout. This tool does 2 things. It displays your MP tick timer on screen and lets you anticipate ticks and plan accordingly. Additionally, it allows you to start the raid countdown at a specific point in your MP tick, so you start off with the same mana tick timings each pull. This is necessary to consistently skip the first Blizzard 4 after the opener, as you won't have the resources to do so without a fast tick. Being able to guarantee the right MP tick timing also gave birth to monstrosities such as the 10 F4 and the Transpose openers, that are only possible to execute with precise mana tick timings. Without the trigger, the earliest you can know whether you're getting a fast tick is shortly before casting your first filler in Umbral Ice, or right after pressing Transpose, which is very late. You will only know what your MP tick looks like after you've already decided on your next line. When using the trigger, you can accurately choose what line to take around the time you start casting Despair. Here are examples for the two previously mentioned AI lines. If your MP take is somewhere in the first half when you cast Despair, you will receive a fast MP take after casting Blizzard 3. If however your mana take is somewhere in the last third of the take when you start casting Despair, you will miss the take when casting Blizzard 3. But you can instead opt to use a Transpose line, which will get you a fast take to skip a filler spell for this line. Sometimes weaker lines end up being better than resorting to Blizzard 4. This probably sounds stupid, but let me elaborate. You will run into the situation where you either don't have the resources or the MP tick you need to execute a strong line. In cases like this, the logical response would be to use a standard line, which as we established earlier has a potency per second of 158. But most high level black mages will actually decide against that and do a 3 Fire 4 line with a PPS of 157. While this is technically a weaker line, potency per second on its own sadly does not paint the whole picture. The standard rotation is a somewhat weak line already, but it takes 31 seconds to execute, so it's not only weak but also really long. Our 3 Fire 4 line on the other hand does slightly less damage over its duration when compared to the standard rotation, but it's also only about half as long with 17 seconds cast time, which means that you'll be able to get back to casting strong lines much faster. This is very likely to gain you more Fire 4 and Despair casts over the course of a raid encounter than taking the upfront DPS gain of casting Blizzard 4. After I wrote this section of the video, Reina pointed out to me that it's actually already a gain over the standard rotation if the 3 Fire 4 line lets you cast another 4 Fire 4 line right after. There are, however, a couple of instances where players might be required to use the standard rotation. This typically happens during mechanics where frequent movement that you cannot resolve by pre-positioning, Instance and Umbral Eyes, or triple cast is needed. Good examples of this are Junction Titan and Eden's Promise Eternity Savage with regular strategies, and Void Gate 2 and Eden's Promise Litany Savage. Let's talk about the strongest line in our arsenal, the 5F4. Unfortunately, the Astral Fire timer isn't quite long enough to use this line without some help from our off-global cooldowns. You will typically only be able to utilize the 5F4 under the effect of ley lines, unless you are a speed black mage enjoyer. If your spell speed is somewhere around 3500, you can actually use this line without ley lines by using both triple and swift cast. Speaking of spell speed, which set is actually better? There's the obvious details. The speed set has a more consistent damage output, and the crit set has slightly lower output on average but higher variance. Unless you want a funny yellow number on your FFLogs profile, in which case you should run crit, it's mostly up to preference. Though your set choice does actually have an impact on how well you can use the AI playstyle. Like I already mentioned, the speed set gets to use a 5F4 line without ley lines once a minute with triple and swift cast. That's already pretty cool, but the crit set is actually much more consistent at utilizing the AI playstyle to its fullest potential. Due to the slower global cooldown of the crit set, you have more leeway to receive fast MP takes. This will save you resources over the speedy boys, and you are much less likely to get into a situation where you need to use the standard rotation instead. For this reason, the majority of non-standard players choose to play the slower crit set instead of the speed set. As you might have noticed, I have only mentioned very few select AI lines in this video, and that is for two reasons. These are the most commonly used non-standard lines, and this video is only supposed to offer an accessible introduction into the concepts of high-level black mage optimization. Additionally, there's a metric ton of different lines people came up with, and the majority of them are only applicable in very niche scenarios, or cost so many resources that they aren't realistically used in an encounter. I will leave 3 guides on the topic in the description of this video, for people who want to jump into the endless rabbit hole that is the AI rotation, or just want to see some of the ridiculous things you can do with this job. Even though I may have made it sound like it, it's not all sunshine and rainbows in non-standard land. There's also a couple of negative points attached to the playstyle. The main problem you will run into is the lack of mobility and weaving space. As a standard black mage, you can use xenoglossies and procs to weave whenever you need to. When using the AI playstyle, the majority of the time you will not be able to use instant cast during Astral Fire unless you have triple or swift cast active at the time. If you decide to use a non-standard line, you will have to know that outside of slide casting you will not be able to move very far during Astral Fire. Keeping up this playstyle in an actual raid encounter requires pre-planning and extensive knowledge of whatever encounter you decide to do. The AI playstyle also does not gain you a huge amount of DPS, so if you end up making mistakes while trying to use it, you can very easily lose much more damage than you are actually gaining by skipping Blizzard 4. The reliance on third-party programs, namely the MP tick trigger, might also be a huge deterrent for players looking to get into Black Mage optimization. Especially since this is simply not an option for console players and they will inevitably perform somewhat worse than people who use the trigger. You will have to decide for yourself if this last point is an issue, but since you're less mobile when pursuing this playstyle, you can get a lot of small DPS gains via minor party adjustments that let you avoid casting an additional Blizzard 4. As an anecdote, I personally typically end up casting 3 to 5 Blizzard 4s in any given E9S party finder run. While when playing with my static, I don't have to cast a single one in most E9 runs. Congratulations, you made it to the end of the video. Though before we wrap this up, I would like to give some big shoutouts to First Bloomier, Explosion and Reina, who have helped me tremendously with some of the details contained in this guide. Make sure you like the video and subscribe to the channel if you found any of the information useful and would like to see more content centered around caster optimization. See y'all in the next video and have a nice day.